Welcome this evening. Our speaker is raring to go, and I'd like to introduce Mario DiGregorio, and he's going to share with us this evening some beautiful pictures and work on his book, Cape Cod Wildflowers, A Vanishing Heritage. And then after the lecture, we invite you to continue with some refreshments, come up and meet Mario, and he has some his books for sale and for autographs. So Mario, without further ado.
Thank you very much. Thanks. It's great being here in Redfield Auditorium, a very beautiful facility. And for those of you who don't know me, I've been walking the fields and meadows and forests of Cape Cod for about 35 years. I like to think in the footsteps of some pretty notable scientists that have made Cape Cod a real mecca for the field botanist and biologist. M.L. Fernald, Asa Gray, even Henry Thoreau loved to come down to Cape Cod from the Boston-Cambridge area and study the very unique and interesting and diverse wildflower communities that make Cape Cod such a special place. Cape Cod juts out into the Atlantic 60 miles and is sort of a line of demarcation between southern coastal species that reach the northern limit of their range and even some northern species that reach the southern limit of their range. And we'll be seeing some of those species during our show tonight. So it's a wonderful place for the field botanist to luxuriate. Well, I saw a study recently by the Association for the Preservation of Cape Cod that stated that excluding wetlands, there's about 17% of the land area of the Cape that is unspoken for right now. The rest of the remaining 83% of the land area of Cape Cod is either already in preservation as green space or has been developed. So 17% is all that we have left in private ownership, and what happens to that 17% is it's a concern to all of us, and hopefully much of that will be protected under conservation agreements or conservation restrictions or whatever. And that's not an awful lot of land on a narrow peninsula such as Cape Cod. I noticed on the way down tonight the Cornus Florida is starting to just come out now. The dogwood is just coming out. And for me, when I see the dogwood blooming, that's a sure sign that spring has finally arrived here on the Cape. Spring comes late to the Cape, as you all know. Our ocean currents cool us, and so we have generally a very late spring. And but on the other end, we have a very glorious and golden autumn that makes November a very warm month, even as the Boston suburbs start to feel the first chill of autumn. I hope you enjoy the presentation tonight. With every development that comes into the Cape, not only is it the construction that impacts our native flora, but the infrastructure, such as road widening, utility line rights-of-ways, lawns, all of this impacts the native flora of Cape Cod. And we've seen just in the last few years a new building boom in which much of our architecture is also taking a hit. The quaint little salt box in Half Cape is now being torn down, and what we call, somewhat derisively, McMansions are going up in their place. And so not only is our native flora and fauna being impacted by this new wave of development, but also our quaint architecture. And it hurts every time I see an old salt box being torn down. People literally buy the land. They don't buy the structure anymore. The structure is something that's in the way that needs to be raised and cleared off so that rather garish three-car garage, 7- and 8-bedroom homes I've seen going up in some of our coastal areas. So it's a disturbing trend. Our last big building development boom was in the mid-1980s when I was conservation administrator for the town of Brewster. And Brewster is where we begin our show tonight. So without further ado, I'll have the lights dimmed. I would like to read from the preface of my new book. Actually, it's a golden oldie that's been re-edited and with a new preface, and I'll read from that. First of all, I quote my favorite philosopher, Henry Thoreau. "It is a wild, rank place, and there is no flattery in it," describing, of course, Cape Cod. Paddling up the Mashpee River on a recent warm summer day, we were moved by the wonderful palette of color from the riverbank. The brilliant scarlet of cardinal flowers, lavender hue of climbing boneset, pink turtlehead, and sky blue of forget-me-nots. Together, these may be but a mere relic of a time long past when Cape Cod was indeed a, quote, wild, rank place. The Mashpee River Park protects the shoreline, marsh, and upland bluffs overlooking one of the last great tidal freshwater rivers remaining on Cape Cod. President Grover Cleveland fished and hunted here, Wampanoag regarded as a center of spiritual power, along with the nearby Noisy Hole. It has not quite been discovered by modern tourism. Land planning visionaries and land trusts have attempted to link large open space acquisitions to create contiguous wildlife corridors for migration, shelter, and recolonizing. Creative acquisition strategies often involve a quiltwork of private, state, federal, and municipal open space in stitching together these emerald necklaces. This creates a real functioning habitat and not a cookie-cutter network of small checkerboard enclaves. The Mashpee River National Wildlife Refuge is a prime example of this cooperative approach to land acquisition and habitat protection. Since the original publication of A Vanishing Heritage in 1989, two significant events have slowed the development and accelerated the protection of significant open space in Barnstable County: the creation of the Cape Cod Commission and the passage of the first Barnstable County Land Bank Bill. In 2001, the U.S. Census Bureau projected an increase of 19% in the year-round population of Cape Cod from 1980. This means an estimated change from 185,000 to 220,000. Given that the latter figure may nearly triple by the summer season of 2010, the transportation infrastructure of the Cape, including bridges, the Mid-Cape Highway, rotaries, and connector roads, will be by then woefully inadequate. So what does this all mean for our wildflowers? Every new development, from a commercial strip mall to a 50-lot residential subdivision, brings with it short-term consumptive progress. Long-term impacts include ever-expanding lawns, domestic pet predation, and the depletion of our natural resources for so-called recreational pursuit. At risk, our peninsula's fragile sandplain grasslands, coastal kettle ponds, barrier beaches, and heathlands. So, I'll end it here. The wonder and serenity of the natural world is a vital part of our existence. Yet, despite our troubled and uncertain times, the spring flowering season brings with it promise, hope, and true reliability. The spring's first mayflower and birdfoot violet means more to us now than ever before. Let's not allow progress to wreak havoc on our natural heritage. So, let's take a look at a few of the influences on our landscape since the mid-19th century, and I'll see if I can operate this. Here we go. This is the town of Brewster, about 1855, and the road that you see bending off to the left is Stony Brook Road, and this is the site of the Stony Brook herring run, which is a popular stop even today. It was actually the center of commerce in Brewster, and this was probably very similar to what Henry Thoreau found on his travels to Cape Cod. He actually came here 4 times in his lifetime, and he describes Brewster in 1857, and if you can kind of look at the bare, sandy hills way off in the background here, right up through here, you could actually walk along the old Kings Highway, which is Route 6A today, and see the Cape Cod Bay for most of the extent of the highway. You can't see any of that today. And this is what Thoreau writes in 1857. Brewster, with its noble ponds, its bare hills, gray with poverty grass and lichens, and its secluded cottages, is a very interesting town to an inlander. The features of the surrounding landscape simple and obvious. The sod, so short and barren, affords the best ground for walking. And that was very much what Cape Cod was like. In fact, if we take a look at Nantucket, this may have been very much like what Cape Cod looked like in the days of Henry Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. This is a wonderful sandplain grassland that is still in existence down in Nantucket. It's called ram pasture. And during the years when there was very little forest cover on the Cape, much of our trees were cut down for everything from shipbuilding to house construction to glassworks. And of course, we grazed a lot of sheep. In fact, in 1850, there were more sheep on Nantucket than there were people. And this grazing created these vast, what I call eastern prairies of the sandplain grasslands, which is now an endangered habitat in and of itself. This is more sandplain grassland on Nantucket. Once again, an open landscape with a big sky, which is something we don't see an awful lot on Cape Cod anymore. If you don't keep these sandplain grasslands open, oftentimes you'll get encroaching shrubs that will come in. So not only is development an impact on some of these open sandplains, but also natural succession. In the foreground, you can see yellow thistle, Cirsium hirigillum, which is a watch list species on Cape Cod and in Massachusetts. There are other things that shape our landscape. Cape Cod has had its share of wildfires and hurricanes. This was the last large hurricane that we had in 1991, Hurricane Bob. And as you can see, we lost many, many trees, including some of our best white pines. You can see by the rather shallow root system and taproot that these are really top-heavy kinds of trees, and so they're very vulnerable to high winds. And Hurricane Bob almost reached 100 miles an hour at its peak. And this is in my section of the town of Falmouth. And you can see just how many trees we did lose. And with every large amount of canopy that is removed, that affects the undergrowth. And we get a lot of encroachment from such things as greenbrier, and some invasive species can also come in and take over after an event such as this. Even one house can make a tremendous impact on a habitat and on a vista that's as open as the heathlands of Truro. This is a bearberry heath, and once again you can see by today's standards, this was taken in 1985. Even a fairly modest house like this one can have a tremendous impact on the visual beauty of the open heathlands of Truro. We used to call these the midnight dumpers when I worked in Brewster. With every construction site, there's a lot of demolition debris. Trees have to be removed. Old cottages are torn down. And with our landfills now pretty much closed, oftentimes there's an awful lot of dumping of debris in wetlands and conservation areas, out of sight, out of mind. And once a large amount is dumped, it tends to attract more dumping. So as long as you're not the first one in there with your truckload, it seems to alleviate the conscience of some of these people that do this. That also obviously impacts our open space. People love to come to the Cape to recreate, to get out in their off-road vehicles, and oftentimes this is the result. You can see even a single passing of a recreational vehicle in the soft substrate of Mary Dunn Pond can impact a plant community. Mary Dunn Pond is world-renowned for its rare coastal plain kettle pond species, In the background, you can see a sea of pink, and that's the Plymouth gentian, which is really the queen of our pond shore species. In the foreground, golden pert, which is a member of the figwort family, also limited to some of these pond shores. And you can see the damage that a single pass of a ATV or an off-road vehicle can make on this delicate substrate. Another element of change on the Cape is the encroachment of non-native species. Generally, with more disturbance, more development, there is a greater encroachment of non-native species. Such species as purple loosestrife is now starting to make inroads here on the Cape, particularly here in Falmouth. If you've ever seen the sea of purple up around Route 1 in Dedham, you know that what oftentimes looks pretty to begin with, it becomes a monoculture and forces out other native species that can't compete. This is cypress spurge. Cypress spurge is a member of the euphorbia family. Poinsettia is another one in this family. But the spurges are notorious. They're poisonous to grazing cattle, and also they tend to take over and outcompete native species. This was brought over in the 1700s as a cemetery planting. Originally came from Great Britain, and is not quite the pest that some of the other non-native species are, but it can overtake a roadside or a sandy area and become quite prolific. Well, let's start at our main presentation tonight, taking a look at our coastal plain kettle ponds. When the glacier left 15,000 years ago, it left large chunks of ice. The ice melted, and concavities in the terrain intersected with groundwater and formed. We have about 350 of various sizes of these coastal plain kettle ponds. And they're really a function of the groundwater table. This is a wonderful population of Plymouth gentian, Sebacia kennediana, which is a S3 species here in Massachusetts, which means that it's special concern. An S1 species is endangered, S2 would be threatened, S3 would be special concern. They're all codified and listed as rare by the state legislature, and we do have a Rare Species Act here an Endangered Species Act here in Massachusetts, which affords a modicum of protection for some of these species. So this is Sebacia kennediana. There's a close-up, and you can see it's a very beautiful flower. It blooms in July to August, and sometimes you'll see tens of thousands of these in our mid-Cape area. Really, no Plymouth gentian grows, for whatever reason, grows here on the Upper Cape. But once you get into the Middle Cape and the towns of Barnstable and Yarmouth, you start to see some of these basically southern species which reach the northern limit of their range here in Barnstable County. It has a wonderful fragrance of lily of the valley. It's really, it smells as beautiful as it looks. This is the closely related marsh pink, Sebacia campanulata, and you can see the similarity between this and the Plymouth gentian. This is an S1 species in Massachusetts, which means it's endangered. An endangered species has 1 to 5 occurrences statewide. It occurs in Barnstable County, in the town of Barnstable and down in Nantucket, and virtually nowhere else in New England. As I said, the coastal plain species are basically creatures of hydrology. As if you've ever seen the fluctuating water levels in some of these coastal plain kettle ponds, sometimes some years the water will be right up to the tree line, way up here in some high water years, 2 years ago, we had an extremely low water year like you see here, and you can see the very distinct zonation depending on the relative moisture of the soil itself. Here in this rather rocky area, we get a separate community of, say, Dortmund's lobelia and perhaps floating hearts and some semi-aquatic species. This is a very distinct band of golden pert that you see, and you can see it likes it a little bit drier than the Dortmund's lobelia zone down here. And then further up, it gets drier still. We get a lot of the members of the Sapirus genus, some of the umbrella sedges, and then way up, where it can become quite dry, we'll get into the threadleaf sundew, and sometimes wild cranberry grows up there. Once again, it's very much a creature of the hydrology of these ponds. And some years when the pond levels are way up by the tree line, it's not a good year for botanists because most of the plants are non-flowering beneath the water. But as I said, 2 years ago, we had just a great time botanizing these ponds. This year, it looks like it's going to be somewhere in the middle. The water is certainly going to be higher than you see here, but not all the way up to the record historic high water line up by the shrub and tree line. Some of the other rare species that grow along these pond shores, this is Rexia mariana, which is the Maryland meadow beauty, a very beautiful member of the meadow beauty family. You can see those wonderful arching stamens. It almost looks like an inverted butterfly atop the stems that you see there. This is an endangered species in Massachusetts. To my knowledge, it grows in Sandwich, in Brewster, and nowhere else in New England. We also have insectivorous plants that grow in these boggy areas surrounding the ponds. This is Drosera filiformes, which is the threadleaf sundew. And you can see for sundews, most sundews are rather small, inconspicuous plants, but this is not. This can grow up to a foot to a foot and a half tall with rather large pinkish flowers that you see there. But you may also note the sticky droplets along the whole length of the stem acts as a kind of fly paper for its insect meal. And sometimes those insects are fairly large. You can see here, I call this my damselfly in distress shot. And they are definitely about to become lunch here. 2 damselflies stuck on a threadleaf sundew. The plants actually draw the nitrogen from the insect, draw it into the roots, and after a while the dry exoskeleton of the insect blows away. So it's a very interesting means to supplement its diet with insectivory. 2 summers ago, as I said, we had an excellent year for botanizing around our pond shores, and under a contract with the Massachusetts Natural Heritage and Endangered Species Program, members of the Botanical Club of Cape Cod and the Islands were looking for this plant and documenting it in Plymouth and Barnstable County. It's Utricularia resupinata, which is a mouthful. It's resupinate bladderwort. It's another insectivorous plant. There are actually tiny bladders on the roots of this plant that act like little trap doors. They're actually tiny bladders about 1/2 millimeter wide with a little trigger on it, a little trap door, and a microorganism will come along, and actually the trap door flings open and the critter is sucked into the bladder, and it then snaps shut and is digested. Resupinate bladderwort, resupinate means turned upside down or turned around. And you can see it looks like the plant, the flower is actually upside down on the stem. You would think that the spur would be pointing down and not up. You can see the size of this plant, a very tiny thing, but we had a great time. We documented many hundreds of them here on Cape Cod and in Plymouth County. And as a result of our work, this plant was classified or reclassified as an S2 species or threatened species, which means it grows anywhere from 5 to 20 occurrences in the Commonwealth. Some plants grow not in permanent ponds, but in temporary vernal pools. And this is one, you can see it's a very interesting, almost a Rube Goldberg kind of structure here. It floats atop the water, and you can see the whirl of pectinate leaves and the swollen stem, the hollow stem. This is Houtonia inflator, known as featherfoil. Featherfoil. It's in the primrose family. It has white flowers on the inflated stalk that you see there. It only is found in those years when certain small ponds and pools which dry up in the summer are formed. So it's a vernal pool species and is a watch list species here in Massachusetts. But I've always found it to be extremely interesting and attractive, and one that is pretty rare. You really don't see featherfoil very often. This was a candidate for federal listing. There's only one plant species on Cape Cod that is actually protected by the Federal Endangered Species Act. We'll be seeing that a little bit later. This was a candidate, didn't quite make it. It's called New England boneset, Eupatorium leucolepis, variety Nova Angliae. And that grows in one site in Sandwich, along one of the coastal plain kettle ponds there. It occurs also in a couple of sites in Plymouth County and a couple in Rhode Island and virtually nowhere else in the world. New England boneset. Let's go on now. We'll move from the pond shore into a drier habitat known as the sandplain grassland. And this is an interesting juxtaposition between a sandplain grassland on the right-hand side that has the little blue stem, that kind of reddish grass that you see there. And way off to the, on the left-hand corner there, you'll see a field which is propagated as an agricultural field with largely European grasses. So the native grassland is kept in its open state that you see here. This is in the Crane Wildlife Refuge. And also for, I guess, for other purposes, the agricultural field is kept as an agricultural field right next to it. So let's take a look at some of the species found in the sandplain grassland. This is an S1 community, which means it's an endangered community. Well, this was a sandplain grassland until it turned into a golf course. And this was taken in 1989. It was one of the best sandplain grasslands that I'd ever seen over in Barnstable. It's now called the Fairgrounds Municipal Golf Course. And there were many rare species that were rent asunder, so to speak, by the building of this golf course, which is really too bad. They had some, they made some attempt to transplant some of the rare species, but once the plants were transplanted, they basically forgot about them because they had their golf course. That's all they were really caring about, and most of the transplants failed, unfortunately. And some of the plants that didn't make it, this is Platanthera lacera. It's in the orchid family, and it's really quite unusual. You can see the lacerated or deeply dissected petals on this. And this generally grew in hay fields and in sandplain grasslands, and was adapted to a certain mowing regime. It would actually flower and set seed right before the first mowing of the year. We've documented this over in the Crane Wildlife Refuge, but it's not often seen. Many of our rare orchids are bizarrely configured like this one, and it makes the whole Orchidaceae family my favorite of field identification. There is a wild lupine. It's not the garden lupine. This is a native lupine, which grows in sandplain grasslands. Sometimes along the sides of old cart roads, you may see one or two plants. This is a beautiful colony that grows on the south side of the Cape Cod Canal over on the west end in Bourne. Literally hundreds of this species, which is a watch list species. When I say watch list, it's sort of the minor leagues of the rare list species. It's not quite rare enough to make it to the official rare list, but it's scarce enough that it makes this sort of a quasi-rare list known as the watch list. And you can see it's very beautiful. It's in the pea family, obviously. And this particular colony is, unfortunately, it's right there where there's a lot of human traffic, and it's oftentimes picked for vases and other things, so it's just too good looking for its own good. If you walk along sandy roadsides tomorrow, you may see this nice violet known as the birdfoot violet, Viola pedata. And sometimes it has the upper two petals are dark and the lower three petals are lighter, so it's kind of a bicolored violet. It looks like a field pansy. It's one of the few violets that have the anthers showing there. And as I said, this is in full flower right now. I saw a nice colony of it in my neighborhood today. We do have a native cactus. Most people feel that cactuses belong in the southwestern desert, but we do have a native. This is Opuntia humifusa, which is the prickly pear cactus. And right around the 4th of July is a good time to watch for the big yellow cactus flower that you see here. The cactus family was once part of the rose family, and you can see sort of a little bit of resemblance of the flower to the roses, the multiple stamens that you see there. This is probably, they're not quite sure whether or not this is native to Cape Cod. It's definitely native on Nantucket, but the question remains, is it an introduction here on the Cape, or is it truly native? I believe that there are some areas of Truro and Wellfleet that do have native populations of the prickly pear cactus, but certainly it was a favorite of 19th century residents to transplant prickly pear to their backyards, which was perfect for the cactus with a sandy, dry soil. This is a threatened species in Massachusetts, an S2 species. Another plant which, well, it's more characteristic of heathland than sandplain grassland is the bearberry. It was called kinnikinnick by the Wampanoags and actually smoked and dried as a tobacco substitute. I have smoked it, and it doesn't replace tobacco, certainly, but it had kind of an interesting flavor to it. And it's a member of the Utricularia, or the heath family, which includes the blueberries, cranberries. It's a very large family that comprises the heath family. You can see the urn-shaped flowers. They are very characteristic of this family. And this is in flower right now, bearberry. I don't know if bears eat it or not. There are no bears here on the Cape. Say a rock rose called the bushy rock rose. This is a species which is very rare here on the Cape, but if you go out on the islands, out on Nantucket in Martha's Vineyard, it's actually quite common. It's in the Cistaceae, the rock rose family, and it is in flower this time of the year in the month of May, and it is a special concern species in Massachusetts. I don't know if that's in focus or not. From here it doesn't look like it, but this is the only federally endangered species here on Cape Cod. This is Agellinus acuta, or the sandplain gerardia. And if you think of all the hundreds of plant species which occur here on the Cape, then you know just how rare this is for it to actually make the federal endangered species list. And it was once much more common when we were an agrarian society, when there was a lot of grazing. This plant was undoubtedly much more common. It occurs in just 2 sites on the Cape, one in Wacoit and one in Forestdale in 2 cemeteries. Sort of the cemeteries act as a kind of refugia, protected zone for what was once probably a very characteristic plant of our sandplain grasslands. And it's now being propagated experimentally in some plots over at the Crane Wildlife Refuge and over at the Wacoit Reserve, in the hopes that someday they'll be able to transplant this back into the sand plains where it belongs, and it'll actually start propagating again and become, once again, an element of our sandplain grasslands. So not only is this an S1, it's an E1 plant species. This is probably very similar to the Cape Cod of Henry Thoreau. You don't get too many vistas like this anymore on the Cape, that literally there are no telephone poles, no roads. It's really quite beautiful, and it looks like this to this day. This is the summer home of the famed American painter Edward Hopper. This is in Truro. Hopper was known for his urban scenes, of course, in his paintings, but he lived on Cape Cod for 30 summers and was actually very interested in seascapes as well. And you can see that this was Hopper's home. This white cottage was Hopper's home, and note the large north-facing window, apparently because Hopper enjoyed the northern light, which is very enjoyed by painters who come worldwide to the towns of Truro and Provincetown, because the light supposedly is almost like Venice in its ambience, I suppose. And what you see here is a classic coastal heathland. And it was up for grabs about 10 years ago, and was finally taken off the market and is now part of the Hopper conservation area run by the Truro Conservation Trust. So this wonderful landscape that you see here will remain protected, and that's a good thing, obviously, when you have a landscape as untrammeled as this. Our coastal heathlands kind of remind me, I go to Arizona most springs, out to the Sonoran Desert. This is sort of, it almost looks like it could be part of the Sonoran Desert if you made those red cedars into barrel cactus or saguaro. You can kind of use your imagination here. You almost see a Gila monster running along the bottom here. But this is a classic heathland with the Hudsonia and broom crowberry in the foreground there. This is over the Marconi site in Wellfleet in the National Seashore. Thank goodness for the National Seashore. That's all I can say. Broom crowberry, Carima conradii, is an S3 species. Now, obviously, being rare doesn't necessarily mean that there's only 1 or 2 plants in a population. It can be literally hundreds of plants, but limited in its geographic distribution. That is entirely broom crowberry. That is well over an acre of almost a monoculture of plant species which grows in Truro, Wellfleet, a little bit in Provincetown and Eastham, and virtually nowhere else in the Commonwealth. But you can see this is a wonderfully lush population of broom crowberry, which flowers very early in the year. It actually flowers in March to early April. It's past flowering already, so it's later than you think right now. This is the staminate flowers of broom crowberry. You can see the red stamens protruding from the calyx there. And this species, once again, is an S3 species. It grows in some of the mountainous areas along the coast of Maine. So it's a plant that likes it rugged. It likes where the sea breeze is strong, where it's very dry and desiccating. And like I said, it actually flowers in March. It's one of our first flowering plants. I apologize for the poor quality of this. This is the only slide that I have of Nantucket shadbush, Amelanchier nantucketensis, and it's noted for its mound-forming kind of clonal growth. Doesn't grow in a shrub or a shrub-like tree that most of the other shad bushes grow. And it flowers in mid to late May out on Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard, where it can be quite common. Here on the mainland, it's quite scarce. It's been lumped taxonomically now with another Amelanchier, stolonifera forma micropetala. So now you can see Nantucket shadbush, I guess taxonomically at least, you can see it out in the Berkshires. So it kind of loses some of the allure of Nantucket shadbush when you can see it out in Worcester County. So I don't know if I agree with the taxonomists on this. I like it as Nantucket shadbush found only on Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard. Frank, that's where it belongs, I think. Shadbush is in flower right now. Most of the shad bushes are. And it flowers when the shad or the alewives come up the streams to breed. Let's go to another habitat now. I don't know if you've had the opportunity to walk on some of our old wood roads. It's really something that I did as a boy as a camp counselor at Camp Burgess over in Sandwich. And I used to love to walk for miles along these old cart roads. Well, these cart roads are fast disappearing. They're all becoming subdivision roads now. They're widened and paved, and it's really unfortunate. This is Turpentine Road. This is actually one of the oldest of our wood roads, and it actually was the municipal boundary between the towns of Bourne and Falmouth. And it's over in the Crane Wildlife Refuge, so it's still there. It still looks exactly like this, and it's a great place to look for some of our woodland wildflowers. You may be lucky to find a trout lily. Trout lily is a member of the lily family. You can see the characteristic golden lemon yellow tepals. The lilies don't have petals or sepals. They have what are called tepals, which is sort of a combination of the two. And this flower has the typical mottled leaves like the skin of a trout. I guess that's where it gets its name. And it opens wide in broad sunlight like this. And then as the sun goes down, it slowly folds its tepals and goes to sleep for the night. And this is a species which is quite common in the western part of the state, but regionally here on the Cape, it's very scarce. This plant is still in flower, although it's just barely hanging on. This is the mayflower, a trailing arbutus, Apigia repens, and it has very nice fragrant flowers. It's in the heath family. It was overpicked for many years as a typical spring flower. People used to pick them for garlands and for table decorations or to wear in their hair because of its wonderful fragrance. And I can remember back in the late 70s, roadside stands that would still sell the trailing arbutus over by the Cape Cod Canal. That's a thing of the past, I believe. I don't believe they do that anymore. But it is coming back. It's probably a little more common now with some of the expansion of oak and pine forests. The best place to look for these generally are on south-facing banks on some of those old wood roads that you see here. It's the state flower of Massachusetts, the trailing arbutus. Take a look at the leaves, the basal leaves of the tessellated rattlesnake root. This is a member of the orchid family. There is one plant that I know of that grows in Provincetown and no other place on the Cape where it grows, Goodyear tessellata. Its more common relative has leaves that look like this. This is the downy rattlesnake plantain, and you can see the wonderful reticulation on the evergreen leaves. So this was picked for people putting together terrariums and things like that because of its evergreen beauty that you see here. It's a colonizing species. It grows, basically it expands by underground rhizomes. And this is the flowering spike that you see here. And once again, you can see the very nice evergreen and white reticulated basal leaves. downy rattlesnake plantain. It's in the orchid family. It's one of the few orchids that grows in dry oak woods. This looks like an orchid, but it's not. It's actually a member of the milkwort family. It's known as fringed polygula, sometimes known as bird on the wing, which kind of looks like a bird on the wing. You can see the rather interesting tasseled apex on the corolla there. And this was actually about to become eradicated. The only colony on the Cape was found in Bourne on a lot that had a bulldozer on it. It was about to become bulldozed under. We did get the bulldozers to stop long enough to transplant this, and it now grows over at the Leary Conservation Property on Shore Road in Bourne, where it blooms just about right about now every year. Right around mid-May, you can still see the result of our efforts to save this plant. It's very common in the western part of the state, but as I said, the only place where it grows on the Cape is in that salvage population over in Bourne. It's a pretty little plant. This time of the year, we get a lot of plants that pop out very quickly, flower very quickly before the canopy shades them out. These are called the spring ephemerals, and one of the best known of the spring ephemerals is the wood anemone, Anemone quinquefolia, sometimes known as windflower, because it's you have a population like this on long pedicels that quivers with the slightest breeze. It's very pretty. All the spring ephemerals are just that. They are ephemeral. They flower perhaps 1 to 2 weeks during May and then very quickly die back down until next spring. Another spring ephemeral is the Canada mayflower, sometimes known as, Canada mayflower, or wild lily of the valley. It's in the lily family. It's one of the few four-petaled members of the lily family. And once again, this is a colonizing plant which grows in oak and pine forests. I just saw this plant in flower today. It's known as Cecil bellwort. The Latin name is Utricularia. Linnaeus, the great taxonomist, actually named this after the uvula, which is that flap of skin at the back of your throat, kind of hangs down. We used to think it was our tonsils when I was a boy. Sometimes known as little marybells. It flowers very quickly. You'd find this flowering under pine and oak in mid-May, but it flowers very quickly and then dies back very quickly. It's a very graceful plant. Not all of our rarities are wildflowers per se. Some of them are ferns and fern allies. This is Lygodium palmatum, very interesting fern. Sometimes it's called climbing fern. And the lower fronds are palmate or hand-shaped, and those are sterile fronds. The fertile fronds, where the spores are produced, are up above here. And it's a true vine. It actually kind of climbs up, very unfern-like. It is a special concern species, grows in one location in Bournedale and nowhere else on the Cape. It's called Hartford fern. In 1869, the city of Hartford, Connecticut, actually promulgated the first regulation, or the first law, to protect a plant from being picked. This is an evergreen vine that was picked for garlands and decorations, and the city of Hartford did pass there was a $1 fine for anyone caught collecting the climbing fern. And back in 1869, that was pretty progressive legislature. This is a very primitive member of the Ophioglossiaceae. That's a mouthful. It's called the adder's tongue fern. It is a threatened species. It's been on this planet about 200 million years. And you can see the rather serpentine strobilus here, and that's where the spores are formed, right along in here. It has a single blade coming out from the base of the plant itself. Very rare. It generally grows in sphagnum bogs. I found this particular population in the town of Brewster about 15 years ago. I have not seen it since, and it's been basically succeeded out by overhanging trees. It's rather shade intolerant, and so succession has played a role in the scarcity of this plant. It's a threatened species in Massachusetts. As I said, not all rarities are in small populations. They can actually be in populations of literally thousands if you get to the right habitat. This is Long's bulrush, Scirpus longii, and you can see the very interesting growth formation. It grows in these circular colonies known as baskets, and this is actually a little bit off Cape in the on the opposite side of Buzzards Bay over in Dartmouth. But you can see it. This is an endangered species, believe it or not. It looks like just a bunch of grass, but it's actually a very rare member of the sedge family. Let's go to our sea beaches and salt marshes now. As I said, Cape Cod is an area of demarcation where southern species reach the northern limit of their range and northern species reach the southern limit of their range. This is one of those northern species which you'd find more commonly up in coastal Maine or even the maritime provinces in Canada. It's known as oysterleaf, Mertensia maritima. And it's a very interesting growth form. It comes in on as a kind of flotsam and becomes rooted in bare sand. And the first growth form is the sort of the mother rosette right in the middle here. You can see it's a very nice kind of greenish blue. Those leaves taste just like oysters, by the way, and just like raw shellfish. And then emanating from the mother rosette are the flowering stems, and it forms these rather impressive colonies. And as you can see, it grows in bare sand. This plant can proliferate 1 year and then be gone for 10 years. So it's really it's a luck of the draw whether or not the ocean currents actually bring it onshore from the maritime provinces, and it becomes established in washover areas and barrier beaches. We are at the, as I said, we're at the southern limit of its range here on Cape Cod. It is a S1 species in Massachusetts, which means it's endangered. You can see it has nice little blue flowers. It's in the, actually it's in the barrage family, which includes the bluebells. Another flotsam ghost species, which I call it, is pale dock. It doesn't look like much, but it's another one of those maritime province species which comes in on ocean currents as far south as Cape Cod. And it's in the buckwheat family, actually, and it's one of the few that are native. Grows in bare sand. I found this colony growing right next to the oyster leaf, so it came in on the same ocean currents that brought the oyster leaf. This is in the town of Brewster, once again. The only non-native species which I present to you tonight is this beautiful yellow poppy known as sea poppy, Glossium flavum, and it has sports the glaucous kind of sea green foliage that you see there, and these beautiful yellow four-petaled poppy flowers, becoming very common along the Elizabeth Islands and the rocky shores, the rocky upper shore of Buzzards Bay. And I oftentimes get calls during the summertime, particularly late May, early June, from people wanting to know what this flower is, which they had never seen before, because it is starting to become established along some of our rocky shorelines. I can't ever think of this as being an invasive species because it is so aesthetic. It was probably brought over in ship's ballast and became established along our rocky shoreline along the west side of the west end of the Cape Cod Canal. Some of our upper salt marsh species are quite lovely. This is marshmallow or sea mallow. Looks like a giant hollyhock. And all of the mallows, the hibiscus genus, are characterized by the bushy stamens along the column and a 5-part stigma. So Rose of Sharon and Okra and Cotton are all members of the Malvaceae, or the mallow family. This is a rare white form of the sea mallow. Usually it's a pink that grows in the upper sides of salt ponds and salt marshes. And it really is a gorgeous plant. You can see the petals almost look sculpted. It's another beautiful species which grows on the upper edge of salt marshes, sometimes in damp woods. Lilium superbum, which is the Turk's cap lily. This is a plant that is astounding in its growth capabilities. It grows from an underground corm, and it's herbaceous, so it actually can grow to the height of a full-grown man and sports anywhere from 10 to upwards of 40 flowers per plant. So it's just a magnificent species. It is grown as an ornamental in non-coastal areas, but it's a true native here along the coastal plain. Called Turk's cap because of the curled back tepals that you see there, supposedly resembling a Turk's cap, I guess. And you can see the long anthers, characteristic of members of the lily genus. This is a large burr, this is large nodding burr marigold that we found it growing by the thousands in the Mashpee River. For whatever reason, all of those Harvard botanists that came down for 100 years missed this plant. It's not listed in the flora of Cape Cod, and it is growing in profusion in the Mashpee River. We're not quite sure why it was overlooked. It's kind of like an aquatic sunflower. So it's a hard species to miss, but even the best occasionally do miss the obvious. Wild columbine, it does grow in the Cape as a native species. It generally grows in headlands overlooking salt marshes. But one area that it does grow in are old Indian shell middens. The calcium carbonate from the shells of the old shell middens that were left hundreds of years ago sweeten the soil enough so that the columbine becomes acclimated to it. I worked with Fred Dunford over at the Cape Cod Museum of Natural History. Fred is a staff archaeologist, and he always wanted to know where the columbine was growing because oftentimes it was the site of these old shell middens. And he would excavate out some of these shell middens and he would find all sorts of interesting artifacts. So it was very interesting kind of correlation between botany and archaeology. There are other species which are also indicators of these shell middens, including horse gentian, which also doesn't like the soil real acidic. And so when you see a plant that likes the soil a little bit more on the basic side of the pH scale, oftentimes there's a reason for it. Calcium carbonate from these old shell middens was the answer to many of the sites for wild columbine. I'll end our presentation tonight with my favorite family, the Orchidaceae, the orchid family, which is really, I think, the epitome of wildflower beauty and extravagance. This is the stemless lady slipper. A lot of people want to know why am I losing my lady slippers? Gee, they used to grow in profusion in my backyard, and now I hardly see a one. Generally, you'll lose your lady slippers if the forest canopy becomes too dense, because they actually become shaded out a little bit. So you might want to just thin out the canopy above where the lady slippers are, and you'll be surprised to see them coming back if you do that. They also do transplant pretty well, although there needs to be the rhizobium fungus in the soil. There is actually a symbiotic relationship between the rhizobium fungus and the roots of the orchids. If you don't have the rhizobium fungus, the transplant is doomed to fail. So don't transplant your lady slippers from a piney woods to an open field. It just won't take. And the lady slipper is beautiful in its albino form. This is a pink lady slipper. It's not the white lady slipper, which is a separate species which grows out in the Champlain Valley. This is a pure white albino form, which is quite rare here in Cape Cod, but it is the pink lady slipper, Cypripedium macaulay. Sometimes you get a really deep red. This is a very interesting, most of the orchids have this Rube Goldberg kind of pollination scheme. The labellum, which is what this big petal is, that's all it is a single petal here. And you can see the bumblebee will enter the fissure here, and he can't get out because the fissure is kind of turned inward, so he's looking for a way to get out, and he finds an opening right here next to the pollinia. The pollinia is a sac of pollen with a sticky adhesive to it. The bumblebee leaves, and if he hits that pollinia just right, it sticks to the thorax, or to the back of the bee. He then goes to the next lady slipper. The bumblebee is not known for its intelligence because he starts the process all over again, enters the next labellum, and if he follows the right track, that pollinia will actually hit the stigma inside and pollination will occur. But pollination is a rarity. About 5% of the plants that I've seen actually have the seed capsule. So it usually actually regenerates by underground rhizomes, asexually rather than sexually. Some orchids are so small you can barely see them, unlike the lady slipper. This is Bayard's adder's mouth, and those flowers are about 3 millimeters long, and supposedly, anyways, I've heard pollinated by mosquitoes. The male mosquito. We all know what the female mosquito feeds on. Us, right. This is an S1 species in Massachusetts. There is a nice population over in Forestdale. The bog orchids are very beautiful and intricate in their flower structure. This is grass pink, calopogons, sometimes known as calopogon. Rose pogonia. Robert Frost actually wrote a poem called Rose Pogonias. He was a big admirer of this plant. You can see the yellow honey guide on the lip, sometimes known as snake mouth, where the bumblebee actually follows that yellow trail right to the nectary. You can see this is growing in a cranberry bog. Sometimes you'll get a rose pogonia with 3 honey, long spur where the nectar is located. Very long spur here. And that's characteristic of all of the rain orchids of the Platanthera genus. It's kind of a milk white, and that long spur means that it's pollinated by a moth with a very long tongue. Oop, I apologize for this. I guess the slide is partially out. This is called pearl twist, or slender lady's tresses. Grows in sandplain grasslands. It has that very unusual kind of spiral staircase form that you see there. For some reason or other, this plant, which is another Platanthera, another one of the rain orchids, Platanthera dilatata, grows in Sandwich and nowhere east of the Connecticut River. So we're not sure why it's found in Sandwich over by Upper Sham Pond. It could be the fact that there may be a shell midden sweetening up the soil, because it's not known to like very acidic soils. As a matter of fact, I find it most commonly up around Tuckerman's Ravine up in Mount Washington is where I find it in some of the snowmelt ravines up there. But there's a very healthy population in Sandwich. It's a threatened species, and we're still trying to figure out why they're in Sandwich.
The flowers look like little flying ghosts. Sometimes known as scent bottle because it has a wonderful fragrance of cloves. That golf course that I showed you earlier in the presentation probably wiped out the last population of the large world pogonia that we have on the Cape, Isotria verticillata. You can see the long sepals and the rather small flower in the whirl of leaves, which makes this a very distinctive member of the orchid family. This is a watch-list species. As I said, I believe that the only population we had was over there in Barnstable, and I had not seen this since the golf course went in. So 4, as they say, but that's too bad for this plant. I want to end our presentation tonight with my favorite wildflower, and that's it in bud right there. It looks almost like a snake's head coming up out of the boggy sphagnum bog where it grows. But when it opens up, it's really quite lovely. In fact, that was our cover photo for the first Vanishing Heritage edition back in 1989. The Arethusa bulbosa probably has always been rare. This is one rarity where we don't have to blame ourselves for its relative rarity. It never has been very common. Legend has it when John Muir first saw the Arethusa, he fell to his knees and wept at its beauty. And you can see it's really quite nice, sometimes known as dragon's mouth. And it looks like a gaping mouth kind of leering at you there. It's a threatened species in Massachusetts. It was growing in a bog in West Falmouth, and that's where these shots were taken in 1991. And then we had the no-name storm in 1991. And what happened was the Interdune bog where this was growing was inundated with seawater from that storm and burned out a lot of the sphagnum where this plant grows. And it has not been seen since 1991. So every Memorial Day we go back to that bog with our cameras ready in the hopes that the Arethusa will show itself, and it has not shown itself in 12 years, but that doesn't stop us from going out there every Memorial Day looking for it. It's really a magnificent, beautiful specimen of the Orchidaceae. Well, who's that? That looks like Pam Poloni. She's a member of the Cape Cod Botany Club, and here she is enjoying a scrub oak barren. As I said, Cape Cod's been a mecca for field botanists ever since the days of Henry Thoreau and M.L. Fernald, and it's just this is a wonderful peninsula that we live on. Let's hope we can protect our natural heritage from further degradation. We don't inherit the earth from our parents, we borrow it from our children. So I end our presentation where we began it in the town of Brewster, and thank you very much for your attention tonight. Thanks.
I'm sure Mario will entertain some questions.
Yes, sir.
How do you distinguish between orchid and a regular plant? Is how it feeds itself? Orchid.
I didn't quite get that.
How do you tell the difference between an orchid
Yes?
and a regular plant?
In a regular plant?
Yeah.
Well, there's certain flower structures that typify a particular family, certain similarities. Just to get technical, the stamens and the stigma are all contained in the same structure called the column. All orchids have this particular feature. That's not a feature found in other plant families. It is a monocot, so that sort of narrows it down also. The orchids have a very special relationship with fungus in the soil, which a lot of other plants don't have. So it's generally flower and seed formation and structure that differentiates one family of plants from another. And that's what the taxonomists are all about, actually classifying
what plant belongs in what family. I hope that somewhat answers your question. The orchids also have this very unique pollination scheme that I outlined for you with the pink lady slipper. It seems that they're very bizarre and very ornate, but their relative rarity and their flower structure, I think, separates them from all other plant families. It just happens to be my favorite plant family. Yes, back there. You, yes.
A comment and a question. The comment is that in the mock moraine parcel in West Falmouth, the lady slippers and the bellworts have been increasing in number and extent over the last few years. And I've been watching that with great pleasure. The question is, you mentioned one species that thrives under mowing and another one that depends on grazing. Before Europeans came to Cape Cod, were there sand plain grasslands, and where were these species then?
It's a good question. Whether or not before European colonization, were there sandplain grasslands? After all, there were no grazing animals pre-colonization, but there were other elements that kept those sandplain grasslands in an open state, most particularly wildfire and salt spray. Salt spray tends to, the salt spray horizon tends to keep revegetation to a minimum, and also wildfire, of course. The Indians actually used fires to open up areas, so the Indians used fires almost as a prescribed burn, but there were wildfires that occurred naturally. And so there were sandplain grasslands. Whether or not they were as extensive as what we had during the mid-19th century is somewhat questionable. The Mort's Relation, which talks about what the Pilgrims found, Governor Bradford writes in Mort's Relation about what they found in Provincetown when they landed in 1620, describes Provincetown as being heavily wooded, very heavily wooded with all sorts of sassafras and oaks and beech trees. So it may have been much more heavily wooded, but they did find some open fields also. So there were sandplain grasslands even before English colonization. Any other questions here? Felix.
You use the term shell midden?
Shell midden, M-I-D-D-E-N.
M-I?
M-I-D-D-E-N.
What is it?
What it is, it's a trash heap. It's basically, it's a fancy name for a trash heap. It's where all sorts of shells and bones and refuse from meals were tossed in a heap, generally downslope from where the summer encampment was. The summer encampment for the Wampanoags, the woodland Indians, were generally on a promontory, maybe overlooking a salt pond where they could fish or shellfish. And so the Indians, and this is something that I found when I was at Mesa Verde in Colorado, where the Anasazi had shell middens in which they tossed their trash down the slope away from the main village. And those are the areas that archaeologists love, because it really, we are our trash. We really are. And they can tell quite a bit about the people from their trash. That's what a shell midden is, Felix. It's a trash heap. Yeah.
Did I miss it, or are there no jack-in-the-pulpits on Cape Cod?
No, you know, when you put a slideshow like this together, I find the hardest thing to do is to try to narrow down, well, what 50 or 60 species do I present? So every year what I try to do is I try to rotate what I show. Jack in the Pulpit made my show last year, didn't make it this year. Sorry. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, one more, yes. Yeah.
This is at the Texas Trading Post, and we have a lot of dark-foot violets, and we had cactus and so on in that area. But they're not there this year. Was it too harsh in winter, or are we getting too much shade?
What were the species again?
The dark-foot violet,
The trout lily?
yeah.
Okay. Because, yeah, the dogtooth violet is another name for the trout lily. But
What's
it,
the violet one? Birdfoot.
oh, birdfoot violet. Okay, all right, yes.
I'm in trouble.
Okay.
Birdfoot, we have a lot of them.
It was a tough winter. It was a tough winter for a lot of herbaceous species. We didn't have that much snow. If we had a lot of snow, then I think our wildflowers would have made it, quite readily, because that acts as insulation from the extreme cold we had in January. January was just brutal. I noticed that a lot of our trailing arbutus, which of course is above ground, it doesn't have the protection of some of our herbaceous species, and I've noticed a lot of browning and frost kill of plants like the trailing arbutus. So it's, it's been tough. My azaleas took it on the chin too, over at where I live. So it was a tough winter. It really was. So that might be an explanation for that. Birdfoot violet should be starting to really pop its head out in the next couple of weeks. So maybe a little bit early to, write it off.
One more here. I'd just like to know why you didn't mention anything about the roses. Any of roses.
Well, I'm partial. I'm hard of hearing, and I couldn't hear that. Can somebody relay that?
Why didn't you mention roses at all?
What about Rosa rugosa?
When you mean
No, why didn't you mention roses? There are plenty of roses in Falmouth. Why didn't you mention roses? Is the question.
Well, it says, why didn't I mention the Jack in the Pulpit? It's just a matter of what you show. Yes, Rosa rugosa is an interesting story. If I can take a minute here, a lot of people want to know, well, what's different with the edition that you put out this past year than what was put out in 1989? Rosa rugosa was one of the big embarrassments that I had as a writer. For some reason or other, writing that first edition, I would have sworn that Henry Thoreau, in his journals, mentioned Rosa rugosa as being the product of a shipwreck in 1849 off the shores of Eastham. The Franklin, which was a botany ship from the Far East, that did wreck in 1849, and there were all kinds of exotic plants that ended up on the shoreline from the wreck of the Franklin. For whatever reason, I would have sworn that Thoreau talked about in Cape Cod Rosa rugosa. And so I put that in our book. And sure enough, as soon as the book came out, I heard endless librarians and historians from all over the country saying, that's impossible. Where is it in Cape Cod? Please cite the passage. So I reread Cape Cod several times. No Rosa rugosa, only to find out that Thoreau had been dead 10 years before Rosa rugosa actually became established here in the United States. So for the new edition, we took that, we ironed that little bit of scientific inaccuracy out of it. So sure, there are lots of roses on the Cape, including Rosa rugosa, which used to be called Japanese rose, by the way, in the turn of the century, which tells you that it's not a native rose. A lot of people don't know that it is actually a native of Japan. So I do have some copies here if anyone's interested. Thank you very much for coming out tonight.